All right. I want to welcome everybody to another episode of The Shadows Podcast. I'm your host, Trip Bodenheimer. And today I'm joined by Jason Earle. He is the founder and CEO of 1-800-GOT-MOLD and MycoLab USA. Sir, welcome to The Shadows Podcast.
Great to be here, Trip. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we had some good conversation going before we hit the record button, which is always a good sign. Usually if I get on here and it's just kind of all right, let's get this thing going. It doesn't bode well for the conversation, but I'm really excited to have you on here and to talk to you. We connected a couple of weeks back, had a really good conversation, kind of prepping for this episode. But just let our listeners know, like, where are you located at?
I am in sunny, balmy Minnesota.
I just asked a recent guest on the show the same question. I'll ask you. Do y'all have this thing called pollen?
When we don't have snow on the ground, we get a lot of pollen. Yeah.
I said if my kryptonite would be pollen, if that was the one thing that would break me down. Like it is. Before we recorded, I actually had an appointment this morning to get some medication stuff. So I'm a warrior on here today, fighting through my Zyrtec and nasal spray.
No, it can be brutal. It can be brutal.
How's the weather right now in Minnesota?
We have freezing rain.
Wow.
Yeah, no, we had a beautiful knee jerk couple of days that gave me the notion that spring might be coming soon.
Yeah.
Followed by snow and freezing rain. So no, not yet. We've still got a little ways to go here.
Nice. Going into April with some snow.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna go ahead and get you started with some rapid fire questions. First one for you. Go to music to listen to.
Depends on the day and the mood. It depends on what kind of what kind of environment I'm trying to create for myself.
You're working out.
90s grunge, Pearl
Really?
Jam,
Yeah.
Temple of the Dog, good stuff like that. Lately I've been getting into it's not quite music, but it's not quite not music. For working, I use Endel, Endel. It's an app, and it's based on, it works off of your personal details, your location, and the circadian rhythms. And you've got various different options. It's binaural beats. It's essentially brainwave entrainment, but it's got really interesting musical components too. And it's been proven to increase productivity. So I tend to go to that often. There's a focus setting, which is this enhanced binaural beats. And that has been, I mean, to say life-changing, I would say it's been life-enhancing for sure. My productivity increases dramatically, and I'm able to really get a lot of writing done without feeling, it just gets me focused. It's really pretty compelling stuff.
Endel, is that what you said?
Endel.
Yeah. Okay.
It's an app, and there's a paid feature too. I have no relationship with the company. I'm not compensated for this plug, but it has been amazing. My better half in the other room, I often hear it going in her office too. So I'm definitely sharing the wealth on that one.
Okay, so I might have to break away from the Beethoven music that I listen to when I'm studying. All right, you have a plane ticket. You can go anywhere that you've never been. Where would you go?
South Pacific, Fiji, any one of those islands far away from a major continent.
Just get away.
Just some silence, and yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, where I am here, this is, I love a lot about living in the northern climate. I'm from New York, New Jersey, and we're up here due to COVID, but it does make you appreciate the sunshine and the ocean just a little bit more.
Yeah, I could imagine. And book recommendation. Got a nice little stack behind you.
I do. Fascinating book that I recently read called Never Home Alone by Rob Dunn. It's hilarious, and it's eye-opening, and it's basically all about the critters that live in your house. And of course, I'm a mold and indoor air quality guy, so I'm interested in all things microbial. especially when it comes to indoor. But he does a beautiful job of telling the story of our homes, and really the sort of nesting ecologies within it, and how we need to be more cautious about how our use of chemicals, and encouraging diversity, and not being afraid of spiders and all that good stuff. And so that's a fascinating book. There's another book I'm absolutely enamored with that I recommend to everybody right now, which is called The Entangled Life. And it's a beautiful tour de force about the kingdom fungi, but macrofungi, in other words, mushrooms primarily, not necessarily molds, yeast like I focus on. And it's written by Rupert Sheldrake's son, Merlin Sheldrake, and it's absolutely fabulous. And fungi is getting a nice boost recently because of plant medicines and things like that. And this book on the heels of that gives people a really fascinating and entertaining view into the scientific and non-scientific aspects of fungi, which is, I would argue, without fungi, I mean, this is inarguable. Without macrofungi, our world would be awash in dead things. We need that stuff, and that book does a fabulous job of laying it all out.
So Never Home Alone, The Entangled Life. We'll have both of those books listed under our book recommendations on our website. I will say, I could have a spider walk across my arm right now and I don't freak out. But a lizard from the front porch walks across my arm and I would lose it. I don't know why.
Oh, that's funny. Where are you located?
Alabama.
I didn't know you guys had lizards.
Oh yeah. Yep. There's a whole colony of them outside of my front porch, and my wife knows it too. Like my daughter and I last night were actually going out to get ice cream, and we walked out on the front porch, and my daughter walked out, and my wife said, "Hey, be mindful, lizards are coming back." And I looked on the door and I saw one, and I just slammed the door with my daughter standing right there on the porch, and I went through the garage. So yeah, pollen, lizards. I'm just not made for. I'm more, I guess, Minnesota than Alabama. All right, next question for you.
Sure.
This will be interesting because we haven't even got into your journey yet. What would 15-year-old Jason say to you today?
Whew. What would I say to him? What would he say to me?
Oh yeah. Let's change that. What would you say to 15-year-old version of Jason? There we go.
It's all gonna be okay, brother. It's all gonna be okay.
Yeah. I was telling my daughter about that this morning. I was like, things that matter to you right now will probably not matter to you in 5 years. Just letting you know. Last question for you. Interesting fact that a lot of people don't know about you.
I rescue plants.
When I first met, I did not know that was something. So yeah.
Yeah, it's I used to rescue people. That doesn't work out well. I rescued a bunch of animals. That's pretty rewarding. I find that plants are remarkably rewarding in rescuing them. And I never intended to do this. It's just that I tend to, whenever we move, for whatever reason, the prior in Manhattan, we moved into an apartment and there were a bunch of orchids that were dying, and I felt compelled to rescue them and bring them back to life. And I have, and I've got in the house that we live now, as we were walking through, you could see that there were just houseplants there that weren't boxed up. Mm-hmm. And so I inquired, and next thing you know, we've got a whole, kitchen full of those plants. And so we just continue everywhere we go. We seem to accumulate these things, but it's my job and my chosen responsibility to take care of them. So we have a little bit of a pretty diverse jungle of succulents and various plants of different sorts, like avocado trees and you name it, in our kitchen in Minnesota.
So it's like Jumanji walking through there.
There's something rather, Jurassic Park like about it.
Yeah, that's awesome though. All right, so you survived our 5 rounds, and that is presented by one of our partners, Giant Worldwide. So definitely go check them out, giant.tv/shadows. But sir, now let's go ahead and jump into your journey. So Talk to us about your upbringing. Where'd you grow up? What'd your parents do? What was it like as a child for you?
If you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I would have a different answer. If you asked me that 10 years before that, I would have had a different answer. My childhood was, classic dysfunctional, alcoholic, 1970s, early 80s. Mary Carr, the memoirist, says that any family that has more than two people is dysfunctional. That's how you define it. And I tend to agree with her. My family kind of perfected it, though. Both sides alcoholic. My grandparents and generations back, and my parents were very active. And we lived in central New Jersey on a little hobby farm / non-working farm where we essentially rescued animals, and we had 5 acres. And I was surrounded by cornfields and soybean fields. And actually, for me, when I look back at it, I think it was a fabulous childhood, quite frankly. I had a lot of freedom. My parents, I was raised by wolves. They were not really around that much. I mean, they were around enough. I was a latchkey kid. And I look back at my childhood very fondly. Then again, it's the best one I ever had, so what do I have to compare it to? The guy across the street, I didn't have an option to live his life, so, but I had a lot of animals. I had a lot of responsibility too. It was my job to take care of them. But when I was really young, when I was around 4 years old, I suddenly lost a lot of weight in a 3-week period, and was having difficulty breathing. And they took me to the pediatrician, who said, "No, you need to take him to the hospital." And so they brought me to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is a renowned respiratory clinic. And based upon my symptoms and my family history, they diagnosed me with cystic fibrosis, which was devastating, especially back then, because it was really a death sentence. And my father had 4 cousins who died of CF before the age of 14. So it hit very, very close to home. That was their worst nightmare. Really. It was their biggest fear, was that their only child would end up with CF. And of course, they didn't have genetic screening or anything back then. So they just, you just went with it. And so my dad said that they cried for the next 6 weeks. And then they were able to get an appointment for a second opinion. And thankfully, and I guess evidenced by the fact that I sit here talking to you at 46 years old, they concluded I did not have cystic fibrosis. Actually, what I had was asthma compounded by pneumonia. And when they tested me for allergies, which is one of my formative memories, they put me in a papoose, like a straitjacket for toddlers, but with the back exposed. And then they draw a grid on your back, and they do these scratch tests, and they expose you to these various allergens. And so my dad just said that I looked like a ladybug, just red swollen back with dots all over it. I tested positive for every single thing they tested me for.
Wow.
Every single thing: grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. So that means sheets, clothing was itchy to me. I mean, my whole life I was itchy. My whole childhood I was itchy.
How did that affect you, like in the farm area that you had?
I look back at this now, and I have very few memories of actually being uncomfortable. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
I have a very, very poor. I have a terrible time recalling pain.
Yeah.
And it's led to me making many mistakes, many times, the same mistake many times. I have a very favorable memory when it comes to things. I forget those things. But I can remember feeling better, but I don't remember necessarily sufferings per se. I remember having to take the medications. I remember people being scared around me more than me being scared, which is interesting. But I actually felt better outside. Which was interesting because I was surrounded by soybean fields and cornfields and grass. And, I mowed the lawn and I took care of the animals, and I was exposed to all these things constantly. But it wasn't really until I was indoors that I felt like I remember feeling weight, the stress, or brain fog, things like that. I remember feeling like heaviness in my lungs when I was in the basement. Never connected it until, to the conditions of the building until much, much later, where, after the career on Wall Street and, reading some articles and some pieces of the puzzle kind of fell in place. But, the house so the dark side of all this, we're on the Shadows podcast. I'll tell you my parents were so dysfunctional and so sick. Really, truly, they were both suffering from various forms of undiagnosed mental illness. But the dogs and cats ran the house, and they would just shit and piss all over the basement, and no one cleaned it up. And we even had a well in the basement. And years later, I said, "What were you guys thinking?" And my father said, "We weren't. We weren't."
Yeah.
He said, "I used to have nightmares that we'd have a flood in the basement because we had water in the basement. We had water. That's why it was so moldy." He said he was worried about a flood in the basement, which would wash all of the feces that were dried up and crusted on the floor into the well. And he worried about that, but never took any action on it. And, he'll probably listen to this show and probably shake his head. But the reality, that was the reality. That's just the way it was. And the relation, their dysfunction in terms of how they interacted with me and with themselves, you could see by the concentration of feces, going up, that my mom's mental illness declined. There was like a fecal index you could come up with it to see, the concentration per square foot. And it started moving onto the first floor, I couldn't have friends over for most of my childhood, except for a couple of people that I just felt secure about. I lived in a wealthy town, and that was a very significant source of shame in my life. Financial insecurity around that, the embarrassment of the hygiene. We didn't have hygiene, we had low gene, and so that was my childhood. And then when I was 12, my parents split up, and I moved out, and all my symptoms went away. Most of my respiratory issues just faded. And I never thought about it again, really until many years later, again, as I mentioned before, which we could talk about later. But my grandfather had grown out of his asthma, and so they just chalked it up to that.
Yeah.
And who knows what else? I mean, you're living in an environment like that where you've got just all that stuff going on. I could blame it on mold. You could blame it on a lot of things, but it was just such an allergen stew. Bacterial, how could anybody not have respiratory issues in a building?
But back then it was probably just when you felt fine, it was, he outgrew it, or
right,
old enough now. Yeah.
It was just completely dismissed because back then asthma was kind of a stigmatic. That was a weakness.
Carry your inhaler with you.
Yeah. So there was a lot there that no one wanted to really look at anyway. And of course, my parents also smoked indoors, including in the car with the windows closed with an asthmatic kid, not for lack of love, just a lack of awareness. And that was what people did. That was the 70s and 80s, right? They'd throw you in the back of the pickup truck, it was just.
Oh, I remember sitting in the back seat of a car, and my parents, we would drive, to the next town over to go to the mall or what have you. But I remember I could still smell the windows up, smoking in the car. Still have no idea the impact it did to my lungs. Here in my 30s, what it's done to me. But oh my gosh, that's classic 101 parenting from the 80s and 70s and 80s. Yeah,
completely.
Didn't think about that stuff. You mentioned you moved out at 12. Where'd you go at 12?
Well, my parents split up, and so I moved in with my father and my new stepmother, who was 20 years younger than my father. She was actually my dad's intern at the newspaper, which the little local newspaper that my mom and dad had bought, and my dad had an affair with his intern, and they went off and later got married and had two kids who are my two half brothers, who I adore. Our relationship is estranged at this point, but I adore them. And I moved into that house, and then that was my dad had this relationship, and I was clearly not thrilled with it. But I had a little brother that emerged out of that, and I really wanted to spend time. I have an older sister who I didn't get a chance to know from my mom's first marriage, and so I decided I wanted to stay there, and that became a real source of contention with my mother. She wanted me to move back in, even though she kicked me out. And
were they both still in Central Jersey?
Yeah, they only moved. She only moved about. My dad only moved about 15 miles away.
What did she do after the newspaper, after the divorce?
Well, my mom was a nurse, and she always was. She was a nurse and an administrator at the local hospital. Not local hospital. It was the local or regional rehab center for like occupational rehab and physical therapy, not drug rehab. And I worked there actually during the summers, and it was one of my first actual jobs on the books. Was working at the in the kitchen there. But I also volunteered there during the summers because she didn't want me to stay home and burn the house down. But my mom was a nurse and she was selfless in so many ways. And she gave of herself to her own detriment. And so so oftentimes she worked, two jobs or midnight shift. And my dad was a newspaper guy, always. And except when he was this speechwriter for the New Jersey legislature. So he was in local politics and 3 martini lunches and, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so it was, it was a typical sort of, lower middle class, existence in a semi-rural area, outside of major cities. And, nothing too remarkable about it. I think, unfortunately, it was all too typical.
Yeah. You mentioned you dropped out of high school. Talk to us about like your mindset back then, like what drove you to that? And then what was your plan B once you did that?
That was the culmination of, first of all, I was not really a big fan of school starting in about 5th grade. That was right around the time that my parents first had expressed interest in getting divorced. And people talked about divorce and being a big deal. And, back then I was like, yeah, divorce, remorse, I don't care. It doesn't make a difference to me. I look back at it now, it is clearly a major issue for me. It was, the dissolution of my parents. This is it was a cataclysmic event. And I don't think I gave it enough credit back then. But I also had become bored in school, just bored. And so around 5th grade, I started being a rather difficult child. And that continued to get worse and worse. And when my parents split up and I moved out, and then my dad moved into a town next door, which is not such a great town and didn't have such a great school system. And there were a lot of troublemakers, and I fit right in. And I just ended up running with some of the tougher crowds. And I was given a lot of latitude, because that was, I was kind of unsupervised, and unsupervisable also. Any type of restrictions put on me, I would just buck off of me, And so anyway, when I was 13 going on 14 was when my dad had his first baby with Sarah, my stepmother, and my mom wanted me to come back, and I said no, and we had a huge fight on the driveway in front of my grandmother's house, and she said, "Well, then if you don't want to move back in, then fuck you, I never want to see you again." And I said, "Well, fuck you too," and she went home and killed herself. So those are the last words that we ever said to each other. And my uncle actually saw that exchange, and to this day still blames me for that. I know in my heart of hearts that was her way of cutting ties. It was just I was the last thing holding her. And I knew that instantly. And thank God I was in tune with myself. I was actually experimenting with a lot of psychedelics at the time. And at the time that probably saved my life, quite frankly, because I was able to recognize what she didn't recognize about the magic of the universe. And how could you throw that away? How could you be so short-sighted? Permanent solution to a temporary problem. And, it was clear in retrospect that she killed, the booze, it was an alcoholic suicide. She was an alcoholic. If she was not drinking, she was drinking liquid depressants, wondering why she wasn't feeling good. Anyway, that one event was enough to knock me into a different realm of thinking. And then shortly thereafter, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease. I'm still not sure if I actually had it, but I was treated for it. And so that was another big round of antibiotics. And those antibiotics did more damage to my cognition and to my gut health than I could ever have possibly imagined. I mean, it took me 20 years to get that back. But the combination of my mom's suicide and the missing school, also the Lyme disease, and all of the antibiotics were just brutal. And I missed a lot of school for being physically ill. And then my general calcitrance, and just I was basically dragged into the office 11th grade, and they said, you're going to have to repeat your junior year. I was halfway through it, my junior year. And they said, you're going to have to come back and do this again. You've already violated the attendance policy. And I said, well, I don't think so. I think I'm going to have to sign out. So I called my father from a payphone and told him I needed to drop out so that I could start working full time to save money at the working at the gas station and get my GED and start college and leapfrog this whole thing and start college a year early. And he said, well, if you're going to do that, then I'll support that. And he came down and signed me out.
Oh, wow.
And that day I went to the gas station from school. I said, I was walking across the parking lot, and he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going home with you. And he goes like, hell, you are. You're a man now. You're going to go to work. So I walked to the gas station, which is just about half a mile down the road. And I told the owner, but I just dropped out and needed full-time hours. And she goes, great, I got another loser. And I was like, no, let me explain. I told her what I just told you. And she said, well, in that case, this is your shift now. She gave me the guy's money. She actually fired a guy that was on the pumps that moment. And she goes, I've been looking to replace this guy. This is your shift. And congratulations. And so I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. So I was working great. I had great hours. I was making more money on tips, fixing tires and stuff. But that was basically, I dropped out of school and that was the most liberating feeling that it was in the way of so many things. And I don't think that's too uncommon either, I might say.
Well, first of all, thank you for opening up and sharing that. And I'm so sorry for your loss. I lost my father when I was 11 years old. And one thing there's two things I want to unpack based off what you just talked about. First thing, you were talking about your mother's suicide. And my father, when he passed away, and I talked about it on my episode, but I would catch him breathing in a bag. And he had this brown paper bag he would pull out of his pocket, and I'd catch him breathing in it. And I would always, say like, are you all right? He's like, hey, don't say nothing to your mom. Don't say nothing to your mom. She's going to freak out. I'm fine. I'm just having a little, it's allergies, or he would blame it on something. And I saw him do this like maybe 4 or 5 times. And when he passed away, he had a heart attack. And when he passed away, I told my mom, I said, I saw him breathing in a bag a lot. And at first it was like, why didn't you say anything to me about it? So I lived with that guilt for a long, long time. And my sister had saw it too, my younger sister. And I know when she passed away, she was still hurting from that because she had seen it as well. A lot of people go through situations, not necessarily the same situation as you, but similar circumstances where you say something and then something ends up happening and you live with that guilt. When was that moment in your life where you were like, all right, I'm not going to continuously beat myself up over this. I'm going to understand this, like we were talking about earlier, as part of my journey and who I am.
That one came fast. That was within 2 weeks. I had straightened out. That was remarkable. And again, I really do have to say it, not because it's like the trendy thing now, but I do think that the psychedelics that I was using, rather than, it was experimenting, but I look at that now and it sorted stuff out that I couldn't have sorted out logically. There was a lot of denial around her death. I mean, I used to go to the grocery store and I'd see her walking down the aisles, and then someone would turn around, it wouldn't be her. I used to call the home phone. At one point I thought I was being duped. I mean, for the first week or so, I thought someone was going to say surprise, like, haha. Yeah. So that your mind does these crazy things to soften the blow. Mm-hmm. But I was actually not even angry with her. I was relieved that her suffering had ended. Yes. And in many ways I was relieved that I was no longer going to have to deal with a lot of the nonsense. I would do anything to have her back if I could do it without rewriting history. Mm-hmm. In other words, if I could have a hug, that would be enough.
One conversation.
Because and I actually had a dream once in my 20s where I had that conversation, and I woke up in the morning and I could smell her in the room. And so as far as I'm concerned, I had that conversation. with her. And I had the hug, and I'm at peace, truly, because for me to wish her back is to say that I wouldn't want to be the person that I am. To regret an instant of your life is to deny a part of yourself. And then who would you be?
Very true. Yeah, very true. And the other thing I was going to ask you too, you mentioned you called your father and you told him, hey, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do. And you had that support from him. How do you think your life would have turned out if he was not for that, if it went a completely different route?
Well, let me tell you something. If the shoe had been the other foot and my dad had died and my mom were there, oh my God, she would have, it would have not gone the same way. My dad's a bit of an anarchist. He prefers to take a path less traveled, or at least he prefers to, he likes to see people take alternative routes. I think he appreciates the rebel, the underdog. He's always been that kind of a guy, which I appreciate. And in that respect, he and I, are very aligned. And I have to give my father credit, because I was such a maniac. And I've got 2 boys of my own, and I just hope karma doesn't come back that fast. I was such a maniac that I don't know how he was able to maintain, to not try to control things and not try to help me avoid disaster. He let me make my mistakes, and he let me become a man by making my own mistakes. Not that he could have avoided them at all, but boy, he could have done a lot of damage to my decision making, or to myself, my internal compass, by having his voice in my head instead of learning how to have my own voice. My mom's voice does not dominate me, or my dad's voice. Like so many people, they have there's some voice in their head that tells them gives them all the shameful, fearful thoughts. And I'm fortunate enough to have not had that kind of over parenting. I had to make my own decisions about what I was going to eat starting when I was like in 3rd grade. So that just never been an issue for me. And I'm grateful for that. I'm scared I'm going to be too good of a father here by normal standards, and actually not be a good father as a result.
Yep. I think the overparenting thing is huge. And I have found myself a couple of times trying to protect my daughter from everything. And my wife is constantly that one that's like, you've got, or now it's been more reversal, where it's been more, I've been saying, you need to let her get through this. You need to let her, you can't be the fixer. She's got to learn something from this. Well,
it's hard.
It obviously worked out for you, because fill in the gap between you get hired at the gas station, you drop out, and then I'm not going to spoil it, but you become a Guinness World Record holder. So fill in the time in between.
It was a very short window, actually. That's one of the craziest parts, is that I dropped out in January. And I, by March, had met a guy. Well, he came in with a flat tire on his BMW. I was making more money in tips than I was in my hourly. I think it was $6.75 minimum wage. But because in New Jersey, by the way, for all the other 49 states who might be listening in, you cannot pump your own gas in New Jersey. So the gas jockey is like a career for some people.
Really? I was unaware of that.
Yeah, you cannot pump your own gas. So when you work, so I don't know if there was like a gas, like a union effort there or whatever, some sort of like,
sounds like it,
backwoods or back room dealings, but basically, that's New Jersey. New Jersey has a lot of stuff like that. And so anyway, I was at the pump, and the guy came in, he goes, I got a flat tire. Can you put some air in it? I said, sure, but it'll be flat again. So maybe if you give me a few minutes, I can fix it for you. And he said, if you could do it fast, there's money in it. And I said, sure, drive over there. And I saw the nail sticking out and pulled the nail out and plugged it and put some air in it and said $5. And he slapped some cash in my hand and sped out. And when I looked at my hand, it was a $50 bill, which I thought was a mistake.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to turn around and come back, honestly. And I kept it in my small-minded, 16. I thought he was going to turn around, and he didn't. And 2 weeks later, I'd spent the money, and I saw him again. And I went up to him and I said, hey, mister, I don't know if you remember me. And he remembered me. He actually knew my name, which is like, the first rule in how to win friends and influence people. Right. And he goes, yeah, Jason, right? Yeah, you're the guy that fixed my tire. And I said, well, I don't know if you realize you gave me a $50 bill for a $5 repair, but, and he goes, well, I didn't have 100. Well, I still feel like maybe I owe you a favor or something like that. And he goes, kid, you don't get it. If anything, it was a good investment for me. I would have missed a meeting. So if anything, I owe you a favor. And I said, well, what do you do for a living? He said, I work on Wall Street. And I said, how about getting me a job? And he goes, you only get in life what you ask for. So call me by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Don't ever bother calling me at all. And I was like, okay. So I grabbed a pen and I started writing. I said, what's your number? And I was going to write it on my hand. And he starts laughing. He was going to fit right in, kid. And he rolls up his sleeve. He had stock quotes written all of his forearm.
So you had like young Gordon Gekko over here.
I was wearing dirty jeans, and I was curious. I had no idea. I mean, I was curious about stocks, but I didn't know anything about them at the time. Anyway, he ends up he gave me his phone number, and I went home. I told my father, and again, supportive. He said, if you don't call him, I'm going to call him for you. He goes, that's remarkable. Most parents would have said, watch out, that guy's weird. What does he want with a 16-year-old kid in a gas station, right? And so, again, I get to give my dad some credit for supporting that optimism. And he is not an optimist. Neither one of my parents are optimists, but there was something about it was okay if I took the risk, but he would never have said he was qualified for that. That's the way my parents parented. You can do anything. We have limits. So, I don't know if they gave me an overinflated sense of possibility, but I'll take it. That's, it worked, but I did see the discrepancy there. I always saw the discrepancy there. And so I called him at 8:59 the next day because I was concerned about that 9 a.m. thing, and he answered and said, what are you doing today? I said, going to work. He said, where? I said, the gas station. He said, wrong answer. And I said, can we do that again?
I like this guy.
Yeah. And I said, he goes, what are you doing today? I said, going to work. He said, where? And I said, what's your address? And he said, 88 Pine Street, 10th floor. See you in a couple hours. And hangs up the phone. And I was like, what the hell am I going to do? I had to call out at the gas station. I had to call out, right? Because I was supposed to go to work. Yep. And I borrowed my dad's penny loafers and stuffed tissues in the toes and a button-down shirt and a sweater over it, and my finest pair of jeans for my Wall Street interview because I didn't have a suit. And I flip-flopped my way up to
foresaw that biz cash look back then.
Right, I was way ahead of my time.
Yeah.
And so I lived, just down the street from a train station. It was about an hour away from New York, which is why I was seeing this Wall Street guy because he was commuting, back and forth. And I went in and showed up, and he goes, "You showed up." And I was like, "Of course I did." And he goes, "Kid, you don't get it, man. 90% of success in life is 90% of success in life is showing up." And he's like, "You'd be amazed how many people don't show up. Come on in." And I didn't realize it, but he was the managing director of a company called Hanover Sterling, which was actually would go down in history as one of the most notorious boiler rooms in the 1990s, penny stocks, IPOs. And it was a notorious place that was my first taste of Wall Street. And it went down in flames of infamy as the biggest penny stock scam firm at the time. It was right in there with like the Jordan Belforts and all that stuff. I was there for about a year before I saw behind the curtain, but I was 16. I turned 17 when I was there. And they gave me this incredible, like, behind the curtains, because I was like everyone's little brother. They all took care of me. All these guys were just like, some of these kids were making $500,000 a month. And they were in their 20s, and they would, drag me along like a little protege. And they were all just completely out of their minds. I mean, talk about, it was a wild, wild, wild place. But about a year into it, I saw behind the curtain, and I realized that these guys were all going to get in serious trouble. And I realized at that point that what Wall Street really was, and that was not Wall Street. And I had a hard time leaving because people would leave that place and get beat up. I mean, if you Google the company and you'll see this: Forbes, Fortune, Business Week. What
was like your day to day like coming in at 9 or
5 a.m. 6 a.m. 5. Yeah, I was either on a 6 a.m. train or earlier at the time, and I would sit there and make 400 phone calls a day. Just 400 phone calls a day, cold calls.
Yeah.
Just calling up and talking to, calling businesses and trying to talk to the owners and trying to qualify them as potential investors. And then eventually once and then cold calling to sell them investments, calling to sell them stocks. And you were successful if you got one person a day to say yes to you. So that would mean that 1 out of 400 phone calls, which is 0.25% success. 0.25% closing ratio would make you a millionaire. That's what I was taught. And so I sat there and made 400 phone calls a day. People would say, you wouldn't be amazed at what people say to you when you cold call them. The amount of negativity that you receive is incredible. Yeah. And it actually, that whole thing led me back into bad habits. I stopped drinking when I was a kid. I started drinking when I went to Wall Street. Wow. Even though I knew it was a family problem, but when in Rome, do as the Romans do, But yeah, my day-to-day was insane. It was a hard 6 hours, be at my desk ideally before 7 a.m. And I would work off until 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
I don't know why I imagine like legit Wall Street, like the phone cords getting tangled up and sheets of paper being passed back and forth and hands in the air and all this. And
it was still like that back then. We had a green Quotron. Yeah, we had like the tickets were still manual. Clients had to call you to get stock quotes because there was no internet. Your calculator on my desk. It was all paper. And it was, I look back at that now, I feel like a dinosaur. But to see how Wall Street's turned into, we used to go to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and it was literally a open outcry and there were a ton of people there. Now it's a TV set. Yeah. And it's all digital and it's mostly, automated and electronic. And so a dramatic change in that world, but I saw behind the curtain and I had a really nice career. When I was 17, I got my Series 7 stockbroker's license, which is a very difficult exam. I was, again, a high school dropout, so I wasn't exactly like up on my study skills. And it took me a while to get to the point where I was able to actually go sit for that exam. But I was fortunate enough to pass it. And I subsequently got a bunch of other securities licenses. And when I left them, I ended up seeing what the rest of Wall Street had to offer. And I had a lovely career. I worked for another, a total of 9 years as a stockbroker. In the last 2 years, I own my own firm, which was, in my early 20s. I went from high school dropout to, owning a stock brokerage firm. And
kudos.
And it was amazing, but that was also right around the dot-com bubble bursting. And, the flip side of this, since we're on the Shadows podcast, is that my drug and alcohol consumption had also reached a crescendo. And I was really self-medicating against the guilt that I had, I think, associated with the success that I felt was probably at the expense of my clients rather than in alignment with them. And that was something that was completely it was a major existential issue for me because my mom had really impressed this idea of service to the greater good, right? Yeah. The idea of contribution. And so that ultimately was the end for me was my success as it reached a crescendo and all my bad habits also got amplified. They say that too, right? If you have more money, it'll just make you more of what you already are. And at the time, who I was getting amplified. And I was not, I would say, a very good person. And I would say I was conflicted. Yeah. I did not have integrity in the sense that I was not integrated. Part of me was saying this, part of me was doing this. Say one thing, do another, disintegrating as opposed to being integrated, right? Yeah. And so I ultimately it disintegrated. It truly did the same way, I was and ultimately that's what needed to happen because it opened up the opportunity for me to be free and clear, to listen and to be open to how I could be useful in this life.
And when you decided to walk away from that lifestyle, did you already know what you wanted to do next, or were you still kind of searching for that?
Not a clue. I sold everything, walked away from my clients, just handed my book over to my partner and put 20 pounds of stuff in a backpack. And then September 11th happened. So I quit. And then September 11th happened. And then I hopped on a train in New Jersey, went through Canada to LA. So all the way across the country, but through Canada. I stopped a bunch of times and, enjoyed all of that. And then while I was in Hawaii, I was reading a story about a guy. I flew from LA to Hawaii and, as opposed to swimming, I should say, that was, but driving. Right. Yeah. But while I was in Hawaii, I read a story about a guy who got sick from the hotel where he was an employee. It was a moldy hotel. It turned out to be a really moldy hotel. It was a $55 million mold problem, actually, at the Hilton Clea Tower. So it was a major real estate news. But the story that interested me was about this guy that got sick at 40 years old, developed adult onset asthma and sensitivities to all these foods and things that he had never had a problem with. And I thought, geez, that sounds a lot like me, and he blamed it on the mold in the hotel. And I thought, geez, I wonder if that was what caused my problem. So I called my father from a payphone, which probably isn't there anymore, and said, do you think we had a mold problem at Old Trenton Road? And he said, of course we did. We had mushrooms in the basement. Why do you ask? He just laughed at me. And I thought, man, so I said, do you think the mold was the cause of my illness? He goes, it couldn't have helped. So again, like this is just, it was just the way it was. People think about mold that way still sometimes too. I call that generational ignorance. We still are thinking about this very clear health hazard as something like the musty smell, the basement smell. This is just it's just a nuisance. It's just the basement smell. No, that's actually, those are industrial solvents. Many of them are carcinogens. That is not just an aesthetic nuisance. That is an immunomodulating, inflammatory potpourri of compounds. That is not something you should be breathing. It's the beginning of decay. It is the external effluence of microbial digestion. You don't inhale in other creatures digestive gases and then feel good. It just doesn't work that way. And so, of course, I became fascinated in that moment. Boom. It was like, that's the light bulb, when I thought, this is fascinating. The buildings we live in can make us sick. Mm-hmm. That's amazing to me. And it's still to this day is the thing that kind of gets me excited, because it's an area where we can have control. We don't have any control in this world. We really don't. We have very little control. We think we do. We want to. We hope we can. We try to force things with wishing and thinking and hoping. We don't have control over anything except for a few things: the food you eat, the water you drink, and the air you breathe. And the air you breathe is only really when you're in your own domain. And yet we exercise very little influence over that control. And it's a shame, because it's a waste. If you can, you should. If you can exercise influence over areas of your life where you can truly improve the quality, and you don't do that, well, that's a shame. And this is one of those areas where you truly can. And I think I intuitively saw that right then and there. And I saw opportunities to truly help improve the quality of millions of people's lives. I thought endless opportunities will be there, because there will constantly be the innovation, and there will be constantly new science. And as I looked into the industry, I was shocked at how little there was out there, how little medical research there was. And this is 20 years ago, and it's made up
2023 or 2003,
2001,
wow.
2001, 2002. I was in Hawaii, and it was a epiphany, to say the least. The light bulb went on, and it has just gotten brighter and brighter and brighter. We live on a water planet. We all breathe air. We all live indoors. And that's my niche target market, is people who live in buildings and breathe air.
You would have thrived in Europe, where we did not have AC, and it was, oh my gosh, the moisture and inside of the homes, and and those places have been around, basements, wine cellars, all that good stuff.
Totally, all those old buildings, but they do better because they're not made of sheetrock. We build buildings out of paper mache. Mold loves to eat that stuff, and so it's modern construction that causes such a unique sort of opportunity for mold to proliferate.
So in 2003, you got into the mold business, and talk to us about Got Mold, like how you came up with everything that you came up with, how you got that company started. Like, talk to us about the ins and outs of what you're doing.
So when I came back from Hawaii, I was really curious about mold. And I actually was reading in the newspaper, and I stumbled onto an ad for a basement waterproofing company that was also advertising mold remediation. And this was before I could find even a mold remediation contractor. I was curious, and I was looking to see if there were businesses doing this stuff. There were very, very few. They were mostly coastal disaster restoration, flood, water damage, that kind of stuff. But these guys were compelling to me, and I answered an ad, and I went in there, and it turns out there were a bunch of ex-stockbrokers, which should have been the biggest red flag ever. But they were going around selling people these repairs on basement and foundation repair, and also mold remediation. And at the time, there were no industry standards or even, reliable guidelines. They were just starting to emerge. New York City guidelines, some other DPA had a couple of pieces. But the bottom line is that I saw that these guys were doing bad work and they were hurting people. They were overcharging for repairs and not removing mold, and people were getting sicker. And I saw this happening all over the industry. And so I got fascinated by the industry, but also realizing, where's my place here? And I thought I began you do free inspections as part of the sales process. And I began getting pretty good at understanding what was going on with the buildings. And I was researching these things at night and taking classes on building science and these kinds of things. And I realized that I could be an inspector and potentially build a business that would protect the consumer from the contractors. And I looked at the other environmental hazards like lead paint and asbestos and saw that that's exactly how it's set up, is that there's an inspector and there's a remediator, and they're never the same. And if you do that, you can insulate the consumer, and you can also deliver a lot of value. And I looked at this as a way for me to earn while I learned too, because I didn't have any business being in the business. I was just a stockbroker, right? But I knew I could learn. One thing, you throw me in there, I'll swim. And so I just got obsessed about it. And I heard about a guy that right around that same time that had trained mold-sniffing dogs.
I was going to ask about those.
That is the craziest thing.
Yeah,
it might be brilliant. And so I ended up going down to Florida, finding one of these dogs, talking to the guy, being introduced to the dog, and lo and behold, I came home with the dog, a $14,300 lightly used dog. She was 2 times on doggy death row. And so she had 1,000 hours of training. Her name is Oreo. She was my partner for 12 years. But I got her before I even had an LLC set up, before I even had a company name. I got her while I was still working at this waterproofing company. And the owner called Channel 6 Action News thinking he was going to get some free press out of it. And they came in and they sent their consumer alert people to try to debunk me. I thought they were coming to do a news story.
Yeah.
They were coming to shoot holes in me. They hid mold in the house, and we went in and within minutes found it. And instead of shooting holes in it, they endorsed us. And I didn't even have a business set up yet.
Nice.
And so we had some local doctors who saw us and referred some patients. And a few of those were really dramatic stories of healing, which then levered into Good Morning America episodes. And then we got invited to do Extreme Makeover Home Edition and all sorts of newspapers and magazines. And it's just been it was an avalanche of media, mostly because people wanted to see this rescued dog that helps sniff out hidden mold in buildings and fix sick homes. And that's an evergreen story that every reporter found compelling. And
so you know who to start a team is, right?
Exactly. No, and I played second fiddle to her with graciously for 12 years. And she and I did thousands of inspections together. And we truly healed countless homes and families. And it was really the most gratifying work that I've ever done. The backdrop on that, though, by the way, is that we went to do some franchising. I was doing all of this, while nursing a significant drinking problem, and I suffered from what I can only call imposter syndrome through the entire time, because I didn't realize that I was really living a double life. I was selling health and not living in accordance with that, so that's 1-800. That company went from, we called it Lab Results initially because it was Labrador retrievers and laboratory testing, and I thought that was
okay. I like that name. That's actually cool. With especially why.
But then we ended up turning it into 1-800 Got Mold, which is another story for another podcast about how I got the intellectual property and all that kind of stuff. But that ultimately we went through a franchising exercise, which failed badly for various different reasons, some of which that were in our control and some of which weren't. And that forced me into a tailspin that was that I lost everything after that. Almost everything. Almost lost the business. Almost lost my drinking accelerated. I really turned upside down, and everything went to shit. All my bank accounts went negative. It was a terrible time, and I was really, due to the graciousness of Sarah, my better half, who gave me
just too much too soon, or what do you think it was? Like, what do you?
With the business, what it was is that all my chips in one basket. I have there's no diversification. At that time, I was all in, and what happened was I invested heavily in this franchising exercise, and I had family invested. I had family working at the company too, including my father and my stepmother, and some of my close childhood friends. Which is all the things they tell you not to do. And of course, those rules don't apply to Jason Earle. So I tried it anyway. I got to make that mistake for myself. And so when we ran out of money because I couldn't raise any more money from investors, we I couldn't in good conscience raise any more money because we'd lost a legal battle to overturn some licensing requirements in Florida, which is where our headquarters was, which would make all my franchisees unqualified to be an inspector. So I got legislated out. And then I had a huge lease that we had signed. And my first franchisee, his kid, as soon as he went home with his franchise vehicle, his 1-800-GOT-MOLD van, his wife took his kids, ran away. And so he had a meltdown. It was just like a cascade of impossibilities. Florida legislation, my franchisee having his wife leave. With
it rains, it pours,
and then couldn't raise any more money, and so I just didn't have anywhere else to go. I ultimately had to lay off my family, lay off everybody, strained my relationships, strained everything, and I didn't have, I already had a bad momentum, and so my drinking accelerated mostly because I just had momentum behind that, and then the bottom falls out, and that if that's the only coping mechanism that you've learned, or one of your primary coping mechanism, that's what you lean on. And thank God it did, because it accelerated it. It's what led me to ultimately get sober.
What it seems like it was starting off great, and then it's, there's still a little Alabama saying, it seems like it was a little snake bit there for a moment. And you mentioned you were kind of downward spiraling. When was that light bulb moment or that aha moment where you were like, all right, we're starting to turn the direction here, where I'm getting over this. I'm starting to recuperate a little bit. When was that moment for you?
It was a period when I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that was a cumulative thing. But it wasn't until about 6 years ago, so recently, in the scheme of things, that I began making a concerted effort to do the rectal cranial inversion and just pull my head out. And I had tried in half-hearted ways, but I didn't decide to engage, community and formalize my efforts. And so that's when that began. And so I began, developing relationships with people who didn't have those bad habits, and began examining these things and reading. And it took me 2 years of solid work of trying to stop and not being able to. And it really humbled me. And I developed a physical dependence on alcohol, which is humbling to me, because it was never going to happen to me. It was going to happen to I'd seen it in my family, never going to happen to me. And it happened to me. I did it to me, and it was, but I look back at that now the same way I look at my mother's suicide as the single most important thing of my life. The thing that I am most grateful for is the fact that I am an alcoholic, and I don't even say I'm in recovery. If I started drinking tomorrow, I'd be an alcoholic again. So that lives with me, and that's okay. That is not a stigma. It's a stripe of experience on my shoulder. I've been there. I've been in the trenches, and same thing with my mother's suicide. It's the same for me. Those are. You cannot take that away. And the things that came from that can't be taught. They can only be learned.
If there's ever a guest that exemplifies everything this podcast is about, this is it right here. I mean, this is your story is a prime example of, how we can all learn from one another's ups and downs. And talk to us about, 1-800-GOT-MOLD. Y'all doing something, you kind of working here with partnering with the Shadows. So tell our listeners about what they can find out if they want to inquire more.
Well, this podcast is refreshing to me because everybody wants to talk about my successes, and I've been fortunate enough to have, many, but behind that is a litany of failures. I mean, I am just like Babe Ruth, man. I'm the strikeout king too. I succeeded at Wall Street by 99.75% of the time failing and not quitting. I burned the ships. I didn't have a place to go back to. A lot of the rich kids that came and sat next to me that tried to do that would quit because they had somewhere else to go. I had the gas station. There are lots of reasons. The reason 1-800-GOT-MOLD is successful, or the reason that my Got Mold is successful now, is because I burned the ships. I didn't have a way out. And I set it up so that even with my failures, I was fortunate enough to be able to pull it out. And so 4.5 years ago, well, it was about 4.5 years ago that I said, well, the only way out of this is through. I want to bring my investors' money home, and I decided to pull it all together. And what the main focus was to figure out how we could take all of the things we had learned through the 1-800-GOT-MOLD inspection business and turn it into something that could truly have the biggest impact. Yeah. And the biggest shortcoming or the biggest gap in the marketplace for consumers is an affordable way to test your air, to see whether or not you have a mold problem without having to deal with trying to find and hire a professional that might either manipulate the data, manipulate you, or cost a ton of money because they're expensive to have somebody come over. And then also to be able to trust that they're not going to try to convince you to do remediation that may or not. That's the biggest gap in the marketplace was that. And so I put a dream team of scientists and engineers together and partnered with the #1 lab in the country. And we put together a do-it-yourself test kit that answers that need, that allows people to take air samples using professional devices, but without the complications associated with professional devices, and get a top accredited lab analysis from the #1 environmental microbiology lab in the country, and do that for, a few $100, a couple $100. And so that's what we have with gotmold.com. But we created a welcome page for this podcast, and I'm pulling it up right now. Do you have that handy? gotmold.com/shadows podcast.
Yep. We will have,
or is it just shadows?
I believe it's shadows, but we'll have
just shadows. Okay, got it. So thank you for that. So gotmold.com/shadows. And on that page, for anybody who's concerned about mold, there's an ebook there called that's entitled "How to Find Mold," which is the easiest thing for you to do as a first step. If you're concerned about this and you got questions about the subject, it's got inspection checklists and a bunch of FAQs, and we get a lot of positive feedback about that. And then we also have a link to our test kit website, which is again gotmold.com. But you go to shadows and you can see you get a 10% discount there. It's shadows 10. Is that correct? And so that gives you a 10% discount on any test kit purchase, test kits purchased with that link. And then if anybody wants to get in touch with me, you can send questions to questions@gotmold.com. Any questions, I see those. You can also go to the gotmold.com and scroll down to the bottom where we have a little contact field. I see all of those also.
Yeah, definitely, folks, take advantage of this. I mean, I can tell you personally and professionally, I've lived in places with mold, especially in hindsight, looking back, like we were talking about earlier, the 70s, 80s, houses, even 90s. And then since I've been in, different places I've worked at, it's been a common issue as well. So definitely take advantage of that. We will have all of the information that he just went over in our episode description. Well, let me ask you this question. When someone mentions you 50 years from now, what do you want your legacy to be?
You left the world a little bit of a healthier place.
Right. Hence what you're doing with the mold, what you're doing with the plants, what you've done with animals. I mean, helping people out. I mean, you've pretty much covering everything there. And what what comments do you have for our listeners out there?
Life's a package deal, everybody wants the glitz and the glam, and they want the accolades, but if you peel the layers back, you'll find that it doesn't come without a price. And the bottom line is that I really do think that we're here to learn how to love and to overcome fear, which mostly means how to deal with adversity. I think that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And I think that if the misunderstanding is that this is going to get easy one day, it doesn't get easier. If anything, you develop the tools to navigate it more smoothly. You get stronger while the challenges get greater. And I think that if I could wish anything to anyone, it would be for enough adversity, enough challenges, enough insight, enough so that you could recognize that attitude really is everything.
That's good advice. I was just mentioning to someone the other day that we often say, if I can get past this one task, it's going to be smooth sailing from here. But no, if you get past this one task, there's going to be another task, and there's going to be another task, and it may be worse than this one, but you will get through every single one of them if it's all about that mindset.
Absolutely.
Well, sir, one more time, we're going to have it in the episode description, but tell everybody where they can find you at.
Yes, gotmold.com/shadows is the best place to find me. And again, you can email questions@gotmold.com, and you can go to the gotmold.com homepage, and there's a contact form at the bottom there as well.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking time to do this. This has been an awesome episode, I would honestly say, and I'm not just saying it to pander to my guest, but we're at the time this one's released, we're flirting with 80 episodes here, and just your story from top to bottom is exactly why we have this podcast here, because there's so many key takeaways that I think our listeners can listen to and apply to situations that they've been in. So bottom of my heart, thank you for opening up. Thank you for being here on the Shadows. I've really, really enjoyed this a lot. So thank you.
This has been great. Thank you for having me, Trip.
Well, folks, that will conclude this episode of the Shadows Podcast.